Warm welcome to this ICAS webinar. I'm Justine Riccomini and I head up the employment and devolved taxes side of things here at ICAS. Our event this morning will last an hour, and today I'm in discussion with the lovely fellas at the Scottish Taxes Government's Tax Directorate. We're going to have a relatively informal chat about all things to do with Scottish taxes with an insider's take on how things have evolved at the Scottish Government. A kind of how did it begin, how are things now chat. By way of background, here's a quick canter through a brief dateline for you. The Scotland Act 1998 established the Scottish Parliament and devolved two measures of power to it: local taxation, council tax and non-domestic rates, and the power to vary the basic rate of income tax by up to plus or minus 3 pence in the pound, which was known as the Scottish variable rate. The Scottish Government chose not to use that. In 2009, the Calman Commission was established as the Commission on Scottish Devolution by the Scottish Parliament and the UK Government. It recommended that for UK taxes, SDLT, that's the English version, landfill tax, aggregates levy and air passenger duty should be devolved to Scotland to make the Scottish Parliament more accountable for its spending. This led to the enactment of the Scotland Act 2012, which provided for two taxes, LBTT and Scottish landfill tax, to be wholly devolved. These have been in place since the 1st of April 2015. The Scottish rate of income tax then also became operational on the 6th of April 2016. Then, following the Scottish independence referendum in September 2014, the Smith Commission reviewed the possibility of extending further devolved powers to Scotland. The Smith Commission's November 2014 received cross-party support in Scotland. That was their report. A key recommendation was that the UK and Scotland shared control of income tax, which should continue, but that the Scottish Parliament should be able to set income tax rates and bands for income received on everything but savings and dividends, and that Scotland should receive its share of that revenue directly. The UK Parliament would continue to define the base of income tax, impose the charge to income tax, set the personal allowance and tax savings and dividend income. So the block grant would be adjusted accordingly. HMRC continues to administer all income tax and is paid by the Scottish Government in return for collecting Scottish income tax on its behalf. The Smith Commission then led to the Scotland Act 2016, which paved the way for air passenger duty and aggregates levy to be devolved, and for VAT to be partially assigned to Scotland, as well as expanding the powers I just mentioned on income tax from 2017-18 onwards. It's hard to believe that the Smith Commission happened a few months short of a decade ago, proving that time flies when you're having fun in tax. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping matters to remind you of. The Scottish Government chaps can't answer political questions or speak to questions around perceived merits of particular policies. They can talk about their experience in developing and delivering policy and the technical side of things, so please, politics and religion are verboten. You can submit any questions at any time through the Q&A facility, which can be accessed at the top of your screen. Questions can be submitted anonymously. We'll be saving all your questions until the end of this webinar for our live Q&A session. Please also join the conversation today through the chat box accessed at the top of your screen. This allows you to comment or discuss with fellow attendees on matters covered by this webinar. We're recording the webinar. We'll make it available for on-demand viewing afterwards in case you want to refer back to it or share it with others. Any slides will be available on the events page on the ICAS website under the event listing. Everyone on the webinar is automatically muted, so there's no need for you to be concerned about background noise wherever you are. We'll be carrying out a one-question poll at the end of the webinar to gauge audience satisfaction. Please make sure you take part. So we look forward to receiving your questions throughout the course of the webinar, and of course we will try to get to as many as possible. Whatever questions we don't manage to answer in the Q&A, we'll pop on a spreadsheet, with the webinar recording and the slides. So I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Ewan Cameron Nielsen, who is the head of fully devolved taxes at the Scottish Government, David Ferguson, who is the Senior Policy Officer for Tax Coordination and Engagement at the Scottish Government, and the international man of mystery whose photos we can't see at the moment is Gregor Old, who's the income tax leader at the Scottish Government. Sadly, I did bill Martin Davidson as appearing today as well, but he won't be joining us. But I'm sure the other chaps might cover his bit off for him without too much difficulty. So, Ewan, can I please start with you? Can you tell me, good morning, by the way, can you tell me how you and the wider Directorate team approach the legislative process when creating new devolved or partially devolved taxes in Scotland? What is it that ministers have tasked you with achieving?
Thanks, Justine. Can you hear me okay if I speak? That's fine. Sorry, getting the technology wrong from the start. Good start. Good morning, everyone. And thanks for the introduction, Justine. Maybe just before I go into that, I suppose just to reflect, as you said, that David, Gregor and I are all coming here from the Directorate of Tax in Scottish Government. So our focus is very much on the national devolved taxes, so income tax, LBTC, Scottish landfill tax, and work then related to Scottish aggregates tax, air departure tax. So we don't have a direct role in relation to NDR, council tax, the work on visitor levy, although that's being led by colleagues in local government finance, but we obviously do work quite closely with them. So as you said in your remarks there, Justine, we're obviously very much been on a kind of tax journey in Scotland. I haven't personally been on all of that journey, going all the way back to Scotland back 2012, but I've been in this area for a good few years now. But clearly we've had more taxes coming to Scotland, more tax powers on the way through Scotland Act 2016. Our role is very much around providing advice to ministers on devolved tax policy and on rates and bans. So basically giving ministers the best possible advice about policy and legislation, etc., to then inform the decisions that they take. And then our role is very much about helping to make sure that the decisions that ministers have taken are then implemented. And for my part, that's very much around legislative change. So I suppose in high level terms, tax policy is essentially informed through the development of legislation in the Scottish Parliament for new taxes. So, for example, when we've introduced the LBTT, landfill tax, and as we're going through the process for Scottish aggregates tax, primary legislation in the Scottish Parliament, then followed by secondary legislation. And again, our role is very much supporting that process, so supporting ministers through the process of that legislative change. And for other changes, it's so for changes to existing taxes, so new reliefs and such like. It's secondary legislation in the Scottish Parliament. So there's a kind of range of work around all of that, and happy to kind of get into that in more detail if it's helpful during the conversation, Justine. We're not responsible for the kind of collection and management of tax, probably stating the obvious, but that's very much so for LBTT and Scottish landfill tax, and as planned for Scottish aggregates tax, that is for Revenue Scotland as Scotland's devolved tax authority. For income tax, that's very much HMRC's role, but we obviously work very closely with them. Our overall approach is very much informed by the Scottish approach to taxation and the principles set out as part of that. And I think getting access to the best possible evidence, a strong focus on stakeholder engagement and kind of to support that process, and really ensuring that the advice we are giving to ministers is basically informed by the best possible engagement with tax experts and industry stakeholders. So I'll stop there. That's hopefully helpful as a kind of initial bit of commentary, and happy to discuss further.
Thank you very much, Ewan, and I'm really glad you guys have come on here today, because I feel that it's beneficial for our members, but also the wider public, to understand more about what happens in the background and how Scottish taxes have come about and who administers what, because there's been a fair bit of confusion about all that over the last sort of few years, ever since they all started to come in. So it's really good. But just tell me something. How many people are there in the Tax Directorate, just to give people a flavour of what's going on just now? Have you got a family tree? And is the family growing?
Put a number on it.
It's a relatively small. I should know the number to hand, but it's a relatively small. It's a relatively small area. But I suppose there's eight people essentially in my area. So that's looking at the fully devolved taxes, but obviously a significantly larger number in other parts of, but a relatively small. And basically bringing together tax experts, economists, people from a range of backgrounds, essentially. It's an interesting question, Justine, about the organogram. I don't think there is something publicly available around all that, but it's something we could consider.
Well, it's interesting to note that, because you're doing an awful lot of work to say that there's relatively few of you. So that gives me and others a flavour of just exactly what you guys have got on your plate day to day. So that's an interesting point. So the overarching policy on Scottish taxes, could you summarise that for me in some way?
So I'll perhaps invite others to come in the back, but I think so clearly a tax has very much a strong focus on revenue raising to support public services in Scotland, and that's a key focus. And I think ministers have made that very clear in their kind of commentary around tax. Within that, there are obviously differences between the taxes, and I think our framework for tax talks about 4 different purposes for which tax can be used. Obviously, landfill tax has a strong behavioural change element to it. It's very much focused on driving down the amount of waste going to landfill. LBT is very much a revenue raising tax, but obviously within that there are aspects of it which are tailored to specific policy aims, the first time buyer relief, for example, and certain aspects of the non-residential arrangements. So I suppose overarching theme around revenue generation, but there are some distinctive differences across the taxes. I don't know if Gregor or anything to add to that.
No, I mean, I think that's right. Yeah, and for income tax, of course, revenue is the one that people get drawn to because it's by far the largest kind of revenue source we have. And I suppose you've seen that just over the last few years with what's been going on, broader economy, challenges for kind of public services responding to kind of COVID and what we're recovering from COVID. There's a pretty clear link between ensuring kind of, stability, enough revenue to support these kind of broader ambitions that the Scottish Government has.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's good that there's been a change between just a spending budget and now a sort of revenue raising and spending budget, because there's a clear path of accountability through that, which we at ICAS and others kind of monitor and do critiques on and things like that. So it's very, very useful for us, but it's also a good way for any government to be accountable for its spending as well. So, okay, I'll move on then. So can I ask each of you, perhaps starting with you, Gregor, can you summarise what you're currently charged with dealing with in terms of existing, upcoming taxes in Scotland? And I'll move on to David and you, and after that, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Justine. I mean, so it's a range of things, really. I mean, it's quite an interesting role. So I lead a team of 4 responsible for income tax policy, and we have a couple of economists in the Office for Chief Economic Advisor who kind of support us in that. So broadly, I think about kind of our work and kind of like 3 strands. there's the obvious bit about advising ministers about income tax policy at fiscal events like the budget, advising them of the impact of, you know, UK government changes on devolved income tax and what that means. There's some interaction with Parliament as well around passing a rate resolution each year to actually formally set rates and bands for the year ahead. But alongside all that work, we also hold a relationship with HMRC, who still administer the tax on our behalf. We have a service level agreement with them, so kind of holding that relationship, making sure they're meeting the terms of our SLA, and also kind of projects like when we implemented the new advanced rate band, we're quite closely involved with them in advance of that to make sure it could be implemented, I guess, as smoothly as possible from an operational point of view. And then, you know, alongside that, there's a lot of kind of just cross-cutting work that goes on within government in my role. So, you know, within the last couple of weeks, we've been meeting with teams in DG Economy who are looking at, you know, the employment interventions they have, which obviously have a knock-on impact for income tax, speaking to teams who are thinking about new grants or social security payments, to give them advice on the income tax implications of these things. So it's really mixed bag, you know, enough to keep us busy.
Absolutely, it keeps you out of trouble, Gregor. There's no doubt about that. Lots of plates to spin. So, David, tell me this. What do you do, and how do you do it?
Yeah, thanks, Justine. So my team's focus is a little different. So our team's responsible for kind of overarching engagement on tax policy that kind of covers things more broadly rather than the sort of specific engagement that you and Gregor's team might do on specific taxes. So for example, we're responsible for the tax advisory group, which you may have come across. So that's a external group of sort of experts from business, from academia, economists, who provide advice to us about kind of taxes and the tax system generally. So we support that group, and that's chaired by the CAPSEC for finance. So that's kind of a big part of our role. We also have a lot of work around budget time. So we do a kind of a lot of engagement ahead of the budget to get kind of views and kind of thoughts about attitudes to and kind of knowledge of tax. So we have a couple of sort of set piece bits of engagement that we do as part of the annual budget cycle. So we run an annual YouGov survey, for example, where we ask people about their attitudes to tax and their appetite for sort of raising, lowering, or maintaining taxes to fund public services. So that's been kind of an annual thing since about 2020. We also run ministerial roundtables for stakeholders, again, to kind of gather views on what they'd like to see in the budget in terms of sort of tax decision making. So anything with kind of an overarching kind of focus on tax generally is kind of what we would do. And that also includes supporting kind of ministers and sort of senior officials when they do engagements that are kind of broader. So if the CAPSEC is going to do a speech at SIPA, for example, we kind of coordinate and prepare that. So it's quite a mixed bag of things. One of the things we're kind of focusing on quite a lot at the moment is the public understanding of tax, because we've heard kind of consistently that sort of knowledge of and understanding of the tax system is quite poor, but less about what that kind of improving that might actually look like. So we're doing a lot of work to think about that and what steps we might take to try and improve public understanding of tax. And that'll be forming part of our consultation on our tax strategy, which will be out for consultation later this year, hopefully. And yeah, so that's kind of a broad view of the stuff my team covers. It's just the two of us though, so we're kept busy for sure.
Certainly,
yeah,
you certainly are. You have my sympathies on the public understanding side of things, actually, because people generally don't really engage with taxation matters unless it's affecting them there and then. So it's very difficult to understand where the root of that education piece should start and how many strands it should have, etc. And I know, you know, we're happy to work with you on that, as are many others. So hopefully, you can have some successes in that area. It's quite difficult to measure success as well, isn't it? Because without surveying people or finding out how much more compliance there is, or how many more people are actually willing to engage, it's difficult to actually measure it as well. Okay, Ewan, I'll move on to you if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So I suppose I've given a bit of a flavour of some of it, I suppose, in some of my earlier remarks, but yeah, so very much focused on my team, LBTT, landfill tax, Scottish aggregates tax. I suppose in just an immediate term to note, there's a stage 1 debate in the Parliament tomorrow on the aggregates tax and devolved administration Scotland bill, which is the bill that provides for the Scottish aggregates tax. So team obviously been doing a lot of work in the preparation for that, and for the work to be done to prepare for the tax more generally. So I think, as I said, engagement's a really important part of the work that we do, and that's both internal and external. So very much obviously having to work closely with a range of colleagues across Scottish Government with different roles in the development and delivery of legislation. In terms of tax policy making, you know, a range of different issues, you know, working with housing colleagues, for example, in relation to LBTT to understand their perspective. But then externally, obviously, the importance of kind of having regular engagement with a range of organisations, including obviously ICAS, to really support the policy development process. And just as an example of that, obviously we set up the expert advisory group to inform the work that we're doing on the aggregates tax, to really try and help shape the development of the bill, and that group is continuing to meet as we go forward. And again, ICAS, obviously, amongst a number of other organisations, is involved in that. So quite a range of really interesting work across the three taxes. And I should also say my team is the kind of the main point of contact with Revenues Scotland, with whom we work quite closely. But
yeah, very much so. Okay, so one of the things that we sometimes get queries about at ICAS is the HMRC's outturn reports, because they don't come out for 2 years after the event, kind of thing. So how do you guys interact with the outturn reports and also the Scottish Fiscal Commission's forecast? Because there's got to be some sort of meeting point, hasn't there, in the middle of the two? What involvement do you guys have with that?
Yes, so I guess this, on the HMRC outturn, that's probably most relevant to myself. So I guess just first off on the Scottish Fiscal Commission. So, you know, for those who don't know, you know, Scottish Fiscal Commission, statutory public body who are responsible for a number of things, but main responsibility is forecasting revenue from devolved taxes, to basically inform how much money we have to input into the budget each year. So in terms of how we interact with them specifically, I mean, we have a protocol for engagement that kind of sets out how we work together kind of in the immediate run-up to fiscal events. Usually they'll begin their kind of budget forecasts a number of months before the actual date, and it will go through a series of kind of iterations and meetings between the SFC and Scottish Government to kind of discuss them and understand a little bit better kind of what's driving the various tax forecasts. And on income tax, the number that the Scottish Fiscal Commission forecast is what gets put into our budget, and similar for the other taxes as well. I guess the distinction for income tax from the other devolved taxes is just that point you said, Justine, about the outturn coming a number of years down the line, whereas for the other taxes, you'll get in your data kind of telling you from Revenue Scotland how much is being raised. So to use this year as an example, in July, we'll get outturn for 2022-23. And essentially, once we get that, we'll be able to compare forecasts from the time of the 2022-23 budget with what was actually raised from the HMRC outturn. And that basically then informs a reconciliation that will be applied to the next Scottish budget, which will be for 2025-26. So quite a few like moving pieces you can see, and quite a bit of, you know, unpredictability and kind of, you know, uncertainty around what the kind of final reconciliation actually ends up being to the Scottish budget. In terms of how that outturn figure is produced, it's produced by analysts in CAI, working to, you know, the Code of Practice for Statistics. And the methodology each year, Scottish Government signs it off as part of something called the Scottish Income Tax Board. And it's also audited each year by the National Audit Office. So that's kind of, I guess, how those two things interact. I don't know if there's anything to add from the Devolved Taxes side.
Yeah, I suppose, Greg, just to confirm what Gregor was saying there, I think it's I think it's fair to say it's more straightforward for LBT and Scottish landfill taxes. Obviously, as Gregor was saying, it's the SSU forecasts that set out what the budget envelope is. So they're obviously a really important part of the overall process. But we're then getting monthly data from Revenue Scotland on LBTT returns and quarterly data on Scottish landfill tax. So you're not quite real time, but there's a good understanding as we go through the year of actually how much revenue is being collected relative to the forecast. There's then obviously the other kind of aspect. This is during the block grant adjustment, but that adds another layer of complexity. But that's something we obviously have to think about as well. And I should say there is also that then requires kind of further reconciliations for LBTT down the line, but in a less complex way than is the case for income tax.
Yeah, and just really briefly, because that's a good point from you and about the in-year data. I mean, outturn itself comes a number of years down the line, but that doesn't mean there's a kind of void of information, I guess, in between then. So, you know, we get monthly data from HMRC from the real-time information system, PAYE, which, you know, I think is just under 90% of kind of tax collected, NSND tax collected in Scotland, to give us, you know, an idea. But obviously it's the timing of self-assessment that really drives that kind of delay in the outturn figure for income tax.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's always been one of those things with the self-assessment system that it's, you know, a few years behind by the time people have filed a return, and then by the time HMRC have processed the data. Just for the viewers' information, you mentioned CAI. That stands for Knowledge and Information. They're statisticians within HMRC and the Treasury who produce these figures. So that's just so as you guys know that. So yeah, I mean, it's I think it's good in terms of the devolved taxes. It's good because, you know, you are getting a regular feed of information from Revenue Scotland, which is, you know, very up to date, and it's as accurate as it can possibly be, isn't it? So I think it's so much easier in a way, and it's still very complicated and difficult, but it's easier in a way to deal with the devolved taxes. Because you've got a direct source of information on, you know, almost in real time, really. And it's a shame that it's only for income tax purposes, the real-time information system. Thank goodness they set that up. I can't remember how long ago it was because I was involved right at the outset, but it may even be 20 years ago. I don't know. Time flies, as I said before, when you're having fun in tax, but it's a shame that something similar can't be done with self-assessment. Maybe that's something that could come for the future. So sticking with stats and stuff for now, there's a set of statistics produced, but which we call the GERS information, which is Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland figures. They come out in August every year. They've been produced by the Scottish Government since devolution began in 1999, but they were originally something of a political tool by John Major's government, which was basically used to try and rubbish the case for devolution. I mean, that's all by the by now. It's just to give people a bit of context, but I personally find them quite helpful in my work, although a lot of people do think of them as just guesstimates or estimates, and I don't actually particularly agree with that. I find them extremely helpful. And do you guys use them at all?
So I suppose they have, because I suppose going back to your point, Justine, about the kind of real-time data. So because we have the data and the forecast from Fiscal Commission for LBTT and landfill tax, they're an interesting additional, source of official statistics. But they are, but essentially the primary driver of the work is around the forecasts and the real-time information that's coming, or the kind of regular information that's coming from Revenue Scotland. They obviously, I suspect colleagues in other parts of the area may use them more than I do, given the kind of focus on all taxes. So they're not something I use on a sort of day-to-day basis, but kind of aware of them, and they provide context.
Yeah. And I mean, pretty similar on income tax. I mean, it's what will be in yours is estimated revenue from all income tax rather than the bits that's devolved, non-saving, non-dividends. But the reality is, to be honest, we have information from other sources that would be the kind of first kind of go to for some of that, rather than relying on the publication itself.
Yeah, I think that they're probably quite useful for taxpayers in general, and just a general public information, because of I personally like the graphs. I'm an images person rather than a words person, so the graphs are really good. I feel they give a good view of what revenues come in from the different taxes and what the expenditure actually is from those taxes. So I find those quite informative, and I think they probably would be good if more people in the general public actually read them as well, personally. But so we mentioned earlier on that you guys really deal with the devolved taxes piece and not local taxation. But what is the technical difference, so that people know? What is the difference between a national tax and a local tax in terms of the Scotland Act and the powers that you guys have?
So this will be one of the questions that Martin would have been ideally placed to answer. But I suppose maybe coming at it from a different perspective, there are clearly different processes in place depending on the type of tax. So for a new national tax, there's a kind of process to be worked through with the UK government to get agreement to essentially amend the Scotland Act to provide for a new national tax. And that's the process. Again, Martin has been leading on this work, but there's a process currently going on between the UK and Scottish governments around the devolution of powers around the building safety levy, which is currently a tax being planned for the rest of the UK. That's a process that takes. It's a complex process that can take time. In fact, does take time. Local taxes are to my understanding, within the kind of competence of the Scottish Parliament, as you've seen with the local visitor levy proposition, but there's a series of criteria which must be met for it to be a genuinely local tax. So, with apology, I don't have to hand the specific criteria, but they're clearly, you can see that things that are, so the visitor levy being an example of something that is for individual local authorities to determine whether or not they want to make use of that power, and each local authority may take a different path on that. I should say, obviously, that's something that's not yet introduced. Obviously, we've just got the bill. I think stage 3 of the bill for that's just recently passed. So I think there has to be clearly local characteristics around that, and certainly if that'd be helpful, Justine, it's something I'm happy to follow up on afterwards and send through further information that you might want to share.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I mean, I think, from my point of view, the main difference is around, the fact that the UK government essentially agrees to devolve a tax, what an existing UK tax, as it were, to Scotland, doesn't it? And then you guys, work up the legislation and apply that on a national basis. So for example, LBTT, fully devolved tax administered and collected by Revenue Scotland, whereas like council tax and what might be, the workplace parking levy or a tourist tax or something like that is capable of being administered and collected by local authorities as they see fit, because they would then have autonomy over whether they decide to even impose a tourist tax or not. So it's a really different scenario, isn't it? Even though we have all these things that we call Scottish taxes, but they're divided up into kind of partially devolved, fully devolved, and then there's like local taxes as well. So it's the picture is quite complicated, really. And because it's not been going for a very long time, I guess people are more familiar with UK taxes as a whole because they've been around for such a long time, and the Scottish taxes have not been around for such a long time. So it takes people a while to get their heads around it, I guess. So tell me something. Why is income tax only partially devolved, Gregor? And why doesn't Revenue Scotland administer it?
It's a good question. I suppose the short answer is, you mentioned the Smith Commission in your introduction, and ultimately is what they recommended, that, we just have the power over rates and bands of non-saving, non-dividends income. But it was something that was given a lot of consideration at the time. And I think, without wanting to rehearse like all of the kind of arguments for and against around that, I guess on kind of savings and dividends income, there was some quite challenging kind of administrative problems or issues that were flagged up. From memory, I think, tax was deducted at source at the time, and it was thought that on savings, it would be too difficult for kind of financial institutions to identify Scottish taxpayers. And I think, as well, the Smith Commission, they weren't just looking at individual tax by tax, they were thinking about the basket of taxes as well. And if you think about savings and dividend income, it's, first off, quite a bit smaller than non-saving, non-dividends income, tends to be more volatile and more susceptible, more responsive, I guess, to policy. So ultimately it was judged that, taking those arguments together, the kind of costs outweighed the benefits, I suppose, of including that within the original package. But, obviously that's not the only thing that's not devolved. So we also, control of the tax base, the personal allowance also isn't devolved to the Scottish Parliament. And I think that creates a lot of interesting, it throws up a lot of interesting implications. So things like setting of the personal allowance and how it can have a differential impact on revenue in Scotland versus the rest of the UK. And there's, whole architecture and the fiscal framework had to be designed to account for some of these sorts of implications.
Yeah.
So I guess the second part of your question then, why is it, administered by HMRC, not Revenue Scotland? I guess it kind of flows from all of that, having a partially devolved tax that sits within the wider UK tax system. There's, just some strong reasons, I suppose, to continue having it administered by HMRC. And I think as well, there's quite strong kind of value for money case as well. So I think in the last year, we paid HMRC a little over £600,000 to administer Scottish income tax, which when you set against, a tax that I think is forecast to raise 18.8 billion in 2024-25, it's, I guess a pragmatic kind of just arrangement, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the simple sort of summary of what you've just said is that there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. And a lot of, a lot of people, I get asked almost on a daily basis these questions, and it's a complex picture. It's, devolution is here, we're getting on with it, and everything else, but it's not as simple as everybody thinks. You can't just say, okay, Revenue Scotland, off you go, administer partially devolved income tax. It's not necessarily quite as easy as that. So I think there's an awful lot to take into account, which people, perhaps get a little bit impatient when they're trying to work out who does what and where's all the money coming from, where's it all going. But actually, there's always a story behind it, and a genuine reason for doing what's being done. So, okay, so in terms of this sort of addition of Scottish taxes into the UK tax framework as a whole, do you guys perceive that there's any kind of increased burden to business or to people like our members, accountants who are trying to administer their clients' affairs? What do you think of that? Is that a difficult question?
So I think I would say is that going back to your question about the kind of the approach in terms of designing tax, clearly, and the importance of engagement, clearly focusing very much on the need to consider that in the design and delivery of taxes. And certainly, if I look at Scottish aggregates tax, which is the kind of one we're looking at the moment, very much looking at how does that, how will the two taxes dovetail in future, recognising that there are taxpayers currently paying a UK tax who will in future be paying a devolved Scottish tax. So thinking about and our role is very much, I suppose, engagement and providing advice to ministers around that. Again, from the point of view of efficiency, effectiveness, important principles. So.
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I mean, aggregates taxes, I didn't really know anything much about aggregates until we started doing Scottish aggregates tax, and it's opened up a whole, lots and lots and lots of different queries simply because of the way aggregates are produced and how they're exploited and how they're sold and the movement of aggregate and everything else. The whole thing is so incredibly complex, isn't it? I mean, there's an awful lot to think about with that. So, yeah, for sure. So tell me, what are your thoughts for the future? Is there any kind of, are we going to see, that I've been lobbying for years now for a care and maintenance bill, along with the other professional bodies. We'd like to be able to see that some kind of Finance Act comes into play so that we can keep things in little boxes because we like it that way. But, do you guys think that there'll be a Scottish Finance Act before I retire?
Not for me to say, with apologies, Justine. But I suppose what I would say is I think it's certainly clearly in part because of ICAS having raised this, as well as other organisations on an ongoing basis. It is the kind of the case for considering of that is still very much on the agenda, and it's certainly something that came up during Finance Committee scrutiny of a recent changes, the recent changes that were introduced to the additional dwelling supplement for LBT, and during the stage one scrutiny of the Scottish aggregates tax bill.
Yeah,
this question came up. I think certainly ministers have said in the past that it's certainly something that requires joint working, as was the case for the first phase, joint working between the government and Parliament, because it takes us into a slightly different space, and it does require that kind of joint working. So certainly ministers have said that in the past, and that's been the position. So it's certainly a live issue, but not for me. Apologies to speculate on what the outcome would be at this point.
Ewan, I'm just happy that it's still a live issue. I think I'm happy with that. Let's leave it there on a happy note. Let me move on. I'll just say thank you to you all just now, but I'm going to move into the live Q&A session of the webinar now. So, feel free, everyone, to ask any questions using your Q&A box. As I said at the top of the webinar, if we run out of time in any Q&A, a document will be shared alongside the recording of this webinar on the ICAS events page. So let me just have a quick look. I was having a problem earlier with my Q&A box, but I don't know if I can access it now. And are any of you able to see the Q&A? I'm just looking for, let me see, here we go. Oh no, I can't see the Q&A. I've got a problem. Can any of you guys see the Q&A at all?
No, I can't see anything.
Okay, can I go to Natasha and ask if there is anything in the Q&A?
Hi, Justine.
Hi.
Nothing has come through as of yet.
Nothing has come through. Well, we've obviously astounded everyone with our knowledge and our explanations, and nobody has got any questions to ask. Although I'm perfectly sure everybody found it very interesting, because you don't get an insight into the Scottish Government's activities very often. There was one thing that I was going to ask you was whether there is going to be, is there a case for well, you might be able to answer this, you might not be able to answer it, but one thing I was going to ask you was, is there a case for potentially devolving more taxes? That a lot of the taxes are, in terms of sort of the scale of income tax and the scale of VAT, which obviously we were looking forward to assigning VAT, but that's not been possible due to methodology difficulties and things like that. But there are potentially a lot of much smaller scale taxes which could be devolved, and I think potentially that would require additional resources at both Scottish Government and Revenue Scotland if they were to be, administered, because at the moment you're all kind of working with what you've got to work with, aren't you? So is there some readiness to take on more taxes? Could I put it that way at Scottish Government?
I'd say certainly focus. So from my perspective, obviously focused in on aggregates tax, the work I mentioned earlier around the building safety levy. There's various other things that have been previously publicly highlighted. So I think there's been a general position from Scottish ministers in the past around ambitions for further devolution. So there's nothing for me to really comment on beyond that. But certainly there's a lot of work going on the way at the moment to look at kind of following on from the Scotland Act 2016 powers, making them so that would be more a question for ministers to get into the detail of that, but I think there's a stated ambition.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think it just depends. We've got elections coming up in the UK, haven't we? We've got elections coming up in Scotland in the next year or so. I suppose it's just a case of waiting and watching to see what decisions are next taken by ministers in terms of all of this. But yeah, in that case, I think what I will do is draw the webinar to a close, guys, if that's all right with you. Well, I guess I've just got a couple of other things to run through before we finish for today, because we've not got that long to go until we're out of time anyway. There'll be a poll question appearing on your screens now. If you wouldn't mind leaving us a rating for today's webinar, that would be really good. Thank you. And if I can just run through the coming up ICAS events, which are about to start taking place over the next few weeks. So on the 23rd of May, we've got the Employment and Immigration Law Update for Accountants. And the 29th of May, we've got Chris and myself presenting on loans and dividends. We're just going back to basics on that one. 20th of June, Companies House changes, update. And the 5th of June is the very much and very well valued ICAS practice conference, Navigating the Future. And I think they've got some very, very interesting speakers coming to that one as well. So that is that. The links to sign up to all ICAS events are, of course, available on icas.com within the adverts for each webinar. Please look out for the registration buttons to be made live so that you can register. So it only leaves me to thank these fabulous gentlemen from the Scottish Government's Tax Directorate for coming to keep me company here today. And of course, to you, the audience, for joining today's webinar. So thank you for tuning in, and until next time, goodbye.